Anyway, welcome to Inglorious Treksperts Live. And this is going to be Inglorious Treksperts Live. And this is going to be Inglorious Treksperts Live.
Live!
Woo! I'm so happy to have you all here. We're talking about Star Trek 59 and counting, and why the hell Star Trek hasn't had its Andor yet. So we'll answer those questions and many others, and you can raise questions too, because as you know, it's a freewheeling conversation where anything can happen. If you recall last year, we had a table fall off the stand, and all kinds of wackiness ensues. So I want to introduce you to our panel of Treksperts and Trek enthusiasts and Andorspurts.
Andorspurts.
I don't know about that. From the Kid Stays in the podcast, it's Caden Miller and Isaac Altman.
Hello.
Frequent Inglorious Treksperts guest and the proprietor of the Burnettwork, as well as the co-writer, director, and editor, God forbid we forget that, of Free Enterprise, Robert Meyer Burnett.
Hello.
The Amadeus of editing.
I'll try and be nice and gentle.
And the writer of such movies as Thor and X-Men First Class, and co-host of Inglorious Treksperts, it's none other than Ashley Edward Miller.
Hello.
And I'm Mark A. Altman. I am also co-host of Inglorious Treksperts and author of the best-selling oral history of Star Trek, 50-Year Mission. Now, I don't have any new books this year, so I have nothing to promote. I'm very sorry. I know you enjoy as I shamelessly plug whatever I'm working on, but this year, I got nothing to sell. So just enjoy this lovely conversation. And I do actually have something to promote. I take it back. Okay. So if you haven't gotten enough conventioning this weekend and you're just antsy for more talking about Star Trek and hanging out with cosplayers and all kinds of wackiness, you don't want to miss Star Trek Las Vegas, Trek to Vegas, coming up in early August, because the Inglorious Treksperts will once again have their own stage where we're going to be talking about all kinds of crazy stuff with amazing guests. Cybok will be there. We're going to be doing Treks Not Taken, where we talk about Phase 2 with the producers. This was the unproduced Star Trek in the 70s. Star Trek The Beginning, all kinds of amazing stuff. So if you're not conventioned out, or you just like spending time in Sin City, join us at Trek to Vegas, Star Trek Las Vegas. You can check that out at creationant.com. We hope you'll join us. It's going to be awesome. Okay, enough of that shameless plug, but I truly believe it. I never promote something I don't believe in. So anyway, I'm delighted that we're going to be talking about 59 years, man. Star Trek's getting old. It's getting a little long in the tooth. What's the state of the Star Trek report, Ashley Miller?
Oof. Look, man, there are highs and lows. I'm gonna stick to the positives. So, or at least the positives as I see them. I think that Picard Season 3 was the movie and the final season of Star Trek: The Next Generation that it actually deserved. I have a deep affection and love for Star Trek Lower Decks, which in my opinion, once I figured out that it was a show about the original series and the next generation becoming roommates and having adventures, I totally got it and I was in. And you know what? There's a lot of Star Trek on TV. You know what? Here's the really good thing that I'll tell you. No matter what you think about the various shows, good or bad, if nothing else, there is still Star Trek in the world. There is still Star Trek to talk about. If the cost of getting something like Picard Season 3 was Picard Season 1 and 2, I'm willing to pay it. Because nobody forced me to watch it.
I want to ask Caden and Isaac, because we lured you in. You could say we baited you with this idea of where is Star Trek's Andor. Now that presupposes that Andor is something special, which it was, which is freaking amazing. But I want Isaac and Caden to tell us the significance of Andor in the genre and why it serves as a template for other franchises to benefit from what we learned. But before we do that, let's take a look at a clip from Andor, in case you're not familiar with the brilliant writing of Tony Gilroy, the beautiful direction, the incredible production design.
Except it'll accidentally be a clip from Battle of Endor.
The sensational acting by Stellan Skarsgård, and as it was so put by you, Ashley, the conventional wisdom is the best Star Wars since Empire, and you said
it's the best Star Wars.
Okay. Let's take a look.
Calm, kindness, kinship, love. I've given up all chance at inner peace. I made my mind a sunless space. I share my dreams with ghosts. I wake up every day to an equation I wrote 15 years ago from which there's only one conclusion. I'm damned for what I do. My anger, my ego, my unwillingness to yield, my eagerness to fight, they set me on a path from which there's no escape. I yearn to be a savior against injustice without contemplating the cost, and by the time I look down, there's no longer any ground beneath my feet. What is my sacrifice? I'm condemned to use the tools of my enemy to defeat them. I burn my decency for someone else's future. I burn my life to make a sunrise that I know I'll never see. Now, the ego that started this fight will never have a mirror or an audience or the light of gratitude. So what do I sacrifice? Everything!
With a major selection of the looks your kiddos love, starting at just $4 in the Walmart app, a new school year means a stylish new them. Who knew? Find skater skirts and Crocs that say, I'm casual but cool. Sparkly sneakers that say, it's my classroom, you're just learning in it. And preppy polos that say, I'm the teacher's pet, even if they're mommy's menace at home. Find their favorite styles starting at just $4 in the app. The Walmart you thought you knew is now new.
Hey, it's Paris. I love sparkly things, right? Like stars. Duh. And thanks to Hilton and AutoCamp, I just slept under them. Picture me, serving looks by the fire outside my luxurious Airstream, making s'mores with the kids, while a national park is our backdrop. The great outdoors meets Hilton hospitality. That's hot. Explore all the new ways to stay at Hilton.com. Hilton for the stay.
USAA knows dynamic duos can save the day, like superheroes and sidekicks, or auto and home insurance. With USAA, you can bundle your auto and home and save up to 10%. Visit USAA.com/bundle.
Bundle savings are off total premium, not available in all states or in all situations. To qualify, auto policy must be active prior to property policy issue, subject to change. Restrictions apply. Membership eligibility and product restrictions apply and are subject to change. USAA means United Services Automobile Association and its affiliates, San Antonio, Texas.
This episode is sponsored by Friskies, who would like to tell your cats hi. Now, if that didn't get your cat's attention, there is one thing that always does the trick. Just pour some Friskies crunchy food in the bowl and you'll hear those paws come running. Works every time. With so many Friskies choices, you can always bring your cats running from their secret napping spots. There's always more to explore. See for yourself at Friskies.com or visit your local store.
I just want you to know, we could sit here and watch clips from Andor for the next 50 minutes, but
especially if Van Halen is doing the soundtrack.
I'd miss the rest of the convention because I would go back and probably want to binge the whole show again. So the question stands for Isaac and Caden. What can we learn? What are the lessons of Andor for Star Trek and for science fiction in general? Why does it work so well?
Andor has something to say. And I don't think that's necessarily true of a lot of current media. Like, they say they have something to say, but they either pander to their audience and think they're stupid, or just, don't actually pull off explaining the message well. Andor's ability to do that traces back to shows that could have meaningful topics and discuss them in intelligent ways, like the original Star Trek, Deep Space Nine, Battlestar Galactica, etc. And it is able to use its budget effectively. It's able to make everything feel real within this science fiction setting without demeaning or hurting the medium or the franchise in which it's a part of. And it is able to pull off its stance against tyranny, against injustice, against oppression very well.
I'm so glad to know I could just go home right now and let you take over for me.
Yeah, screw it. Let's go to the bar.
But Caden, what about you? Can you amplify that for us?
Yeah, I think, as an overall, I think Andor works because it's written to be good. It's not written to be more Star Wars, which I think is kind of a problem that a lot of different media franchises have, where when they need to make sequels, TV series, whatever, it's written to be more of a thing rather than to be a good thing, like what Andor's doing. That it's like, it still fits within the medium, but it's also a good interpretation of that medium that does something interesting rather than just being more of it.
Rob, before I ask you to assess the state of the Star Trek Union, I do want to ask you, what they brought up is an interesting point. Tony Gilroy is a self-professed non-Star Wars fan.
Probably not a Star Trek fan either.
He wasn't a fan of Star Wars, but he respected the canon. He wanted to honor Star Wars and do right by it. He didn't want to contradict what was going on. So even though it was kind of like Nick Meyer when he did Star Trek 2. He said, I couldn't get past the ears, so I never watched Star Trek. And then he learned what it was about Star Trek that worked, the Horatio Hornblower of it all, the submarine movie of it all, and created something really special, and did it again with 4 and 6. Sorry, DAREN DOCHTERMAN. And I wonder if you can speak to that, because at times we say, we need people who understand Star Trek, we need people who know Star Trek, and yet you look at Tony Gilroy's incredible achievement with Andor, you look at what Nick Meyer achieved with Star Trek. So which is it, or is it both?
Well, it's really interesting, because if you go back and you look at the original Star Wars, there are scenes in that movie where you first see the Death Star, and we learn something about how the Empire works when the Imperial officers are having a discussion about, until this battle station is fully operational, we are vulnerable. The Rebel Alliance is too well equipped. And they're talking about how the Empire works, and Governor Tarkin comes in with Vader, and there isn't a whole lot of talk about Jedis and lightsabers. This is an empire that is trying to maintain control over its star system. And then when you meet Luke, he talks about, of the rebellion against the Empire? And if you look at, it's called Star Wars. It's not called Star Force or Star Jedi. And it is a fairy tale within a wartime setting. And somebody like Tony Gilroy, who is a self-professed, he's been studying rebellions, and if you ask him, he's an Academy Award-nominated screenwriter about these subjects, about warfare and how do rebellions happen. And he keyed on one sector or one section of the Star Wars mythos that interested him. And so what he wanted to do is go, okay, the overarching story of Star Wars has this built into it, something I've been interested in my whole life. So why hasn't this franchise delved into the war of the Star Wars? And so he decided to do that. And what he did was, like any great storyteller, he wanted to delve into the human truths. Why has warfare never left mankind? And why have we seen, especially in the 20th century, or if you're a fan of Rome or whatever you're interested in terms of history, why do men think about the Roman Empire? Because it's interesting and we wish we were there so we could triumph and be Maximus or whatever it is.
Clothes are awesome.
But so what Tony Gilroy did was he took his interests in the great human truths of conflict and why do wars happen? What happens within wars? Why do people decide to fight for what's right? And he decided to use, because he was given an opportunity, the Star Wars context to delve into what all great stories do, the great human truths of, we've had thousands of years of conflict that you can look at and use the science fiction context of Star Wars to tell a story about rebellion in a way the Star Wars makes it, it's the spoonful of sugar that helps the medicine go down, essentially. And he was able to tell a timeless, amazing story about all of human history in terms of a certain, warfare or whatever, and using Star Wars as that framework to get people to come watch. And it's the same reason that Rod Serling created The Twilight Zone, and the same reason Gene Roddenberry created Star Trek, to tell tales, because at the time you couldn't tell a story about the Vietnam War. You couldn't tell a story about racism directly because of standards and practices. But if you said it in space, on a spaceship, it's not about Earth, it's not about us, it's about people in the future. And so standards and practices are like, it's science fiction. You tell your story. And what Tony Gilroy did was he took the great responsibility of Star Wars, essentially a fairy tale, and elevated it. And told a timeless tale that I wish the people who controlled Star Trek had one iota of understanding of what they could be doing with the franchise.
I want to ask Ashley about that because, of course, Gene Roddenberry...
Thank you. Thank you very much.
That's for me, not him, right?
Yeah. Okay. Gene Roddenberry and Gene Kuhn were both veterans of World War II, and they abhorred war. And they, Gene Kuhn in particular built in these stories of, trying to understand, like, the Gorn in Arena, not in Strange New Worlds, in Arena, where we encounter an alien that has wiped out Cestastry, and all we want is revenge, and then we realize, wait a second, maybe we need to figure out what their intent was, and Kirk spares, or casualties in a war that walk in disintegration chambers that are just statistics, like in Vietnam became to a lot of the on the news, and these are stories that only deep people who would experience these things could write about. Nick Meyer is obviously extremely smart, and he won't hesitate to tell you that he is knows history, he knows politics, and it's the same thing with Gilroy, who's incredible, knowledgeable about history and has a lot to say. And of course, there's the old Santayana quote, those who forget the past are condemned to relive it. So is the problem not that people don't understand Star Trek, but you have people who are not knowledgeable about anything other than television?
Yeah, man. Look, the truth of the matter is that any great writer or artist of any kind is really just the sum of his or her experiences, and how we choose to convey those experiences in a given medium. And when you're talking about somebody like a Gene Kuhn, a Nick Meyer, a Tony Gilroy, you're talking about people who've obviously experienced very different things in their lives, and the stories that they become attracted to and the way that they want to tell stories are a function of the experiences that they've had. And to kind of revise a little bit of what Isaac said about how Andor has something to say, I think it's more than that. Look, really crappy artists also have something to say. They just say it inartfully. They say it clumsily. It's obvious when they say it. I think somebody like a Tony Gilroy or a Gene Kuhn, they're not just telling us what they think. They're telling us what they think about. And they present it from multiple angles, right? It's a debate, it's a conversation, it's a dialectic, and it's not trying to hand to you like this is good and this is bad, because you can do that. You can just say those things. You watch Andor, and Andor doesn't just decide one day that he wants to fight for the rebellion because that's the right thing to do and a tasty way to do it, right? He has to come to that. He struggles with it at all times. He is not a true believer, even though he is absolutely a true believer, right? He is constantly struggling, like, with what are his values, what's most important. And you go back to Star Trek, or you go to Deep Space Nine, and you see those sorts of stories being told. And if you don't have that, what you get is a show that's just about itself, right? Like you said, it's like people who have only had experience writing television. And so, and as Caden said, they just write about more. The context becomes the story. when I was, on the Sarah Connor Chronicles, we would talk a lot about shows that would lose their way, like, Heroes or Lost, right? The moment, and you can go and you can track it, the moment that these things become about themselves, when the experience that you're writing about or that you're, telling a story about is just the context that you've created for a story, the phrase we came up with is, you have jumped up your own asshole. And honestly, for the most part, not across the board, but for the most part, Star Trek has jumped up its own asshole. A lot of Star Wars has jumped right up its own wormhole too. I mean, there's a lot of jumping. I know, I got to read this thing. It's like,
it says no cursing. Many of your
does it?
Is under 18.
No, I just need to be aware you're under 18 years.
Including many of your panelists
totally
may be
aware.
under 18.
Yeah.
Although it's nothing Isaac hasn't heard before.
Right. But there you go. I don't know, man. That's just one guy's opinion.
Well, look, I think it's really interesting because I think what we've come to accept as a truism is that great science fiction isn't about the future. It's really about our present. That's what Star Trek was about. It was the original was about the 60s, and Next Generation was about the 90s, and Deep Space Nine was about, the LA riots, and, it's like so much of what is going on. It's about commenting about the present. And that the incredible thing about Andor is that Tony Gilroy wrote and produced this, pretty much 2 years ago, and it is so prescient because it's dealing with our present now.
But it always will be. That's the beauty of it.
And it is so remarkable that Andor is so much a part of the cultural conversation right now because of what is going on in the world. But my thing with Star Trek is, what do they say about alcoholism? The first thing is admitting you have a problem. And
the
Star
second thing
Trek
is that vodka's awesome.
hasn't admitted it had a problem.
Yeah.
So instead, we're still doing Beatlemania. We're still doing Strange New Worlds, which is just an incredible simulation. And when I say incredible, I'm not using it as an adjective to describe it artfully. I'm saying that it's a simulation of things that have gone before. But also, the other issue is that Star Trek, you get the sense that the people who make it are often embarrassed by it rather than embracing it. And the biggest problem is, a lot of times on the studio level, and this was happening a lot in the last couple of years, everybody was saying, before they all retrenched and stopped spending money, we want our Game of Thrones, our sci-fi Game of Thrones. And the thought was, okay, well, what is Game of Thrones? People curse in it, right? That's not what made Game of Thrones work. They misunderstand what makes Game of Thrones what it was.
Yep.
And unfortunately, I think what we're asking for, at least, I'd love to, sort of go to Rob because Rob has very strong feelings about.
You could say
well,
that.
no, I didn't go to you. I was going to go to you.
Oh, yeah.
But if you can talk about just how you feel about what it takes to write great Star Trek, and why Andor is such a good model for Star Trek. But Star Wars and Star Trek are two very different things, and yet, from a production point of view, it's a good template.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, look, the reality is that one of the reasons why Andor works is because the canvas is broad enough to allow it to work. But if you look at each of those individual, it's actually a really interesting exercise in scaling. So, either season, you've got these 3-episode pods. All those episodes, all those pods add up together and sort of a big story for the season. But if you look at those individual episodes, all of those individual episodes tell a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end, right? Which seems basic, but you would be stunned at how often that doesn't happen. Discovery Season 1. Or I don't know, I had something caught in my throat and it just kind of came out. And that's not really what makes Star Trek great, right? Like Star Trek wants to be anthological to a certain extent. It wants to dive into these things like on a case-by-case basis. And what was special about Deep Space Nine, which I think is the show that most resembles Andor, is that it managed to maintain that episodic quality while also telling a story across a big canvas. And all those things are very hard to do because what you've got to keep in your head is the reality that your characters are living in, and you have to believe in that reality, and you have to be honest with them. Something that, again, Deep Space Nine and the original series and Andor, something they don't do is they do not rescue their main characters from their choices, right? Whether, it's anything that Andor does, really. Like in any one of his stories, there are always consequences. He always eats a crap sandwich for it. He always struggles with the outcome. Sometimes he does things that make us go, oof, right? But we know that he's the hero, he's the man, in the same way that, Captain Sisko, in The Pale Moonlight. It's like he lets Garrick murder a senator. He perpetuates a lie. Why? Because it's the thing that has to be done. What does he sacrifice? Everything.
Everything.
Yeah, and I mean, it's a good analogy because Sisko sacrifices his conscience for what he does. Because Deep Space Nine, was the most ambitious of the Star Trek shows. And then Battlestar Galactica took what only Deep Space Nine could have done for Star Trek and then took it to another level. And Andor sort of takes what Battlestar Galactica did and takes it to a level only it could go, partially because of budget, partially because streaming has changed the equation. I mean, they're all great shows, but they definitely are, I don't think you could have had, Battlestar Galactica without Deep Space Nine. And in a way, you couldn't have Andor without Battlestar Galactica.
No way. I mean, I'll tell you, here's like a thing that it's very simple, but it to me, it tells you everything about Andor and why it's different. So, the end of the first pod of this season, right? When Tay gets driven away, spoiler alert.
The banker.
Yeah, and it's just Mon Mothma, and she's drinking and she's dancing. It's such a powerful cinematic character moment. And so much time and energy and production value gets devoted to bringing that moment to life. But without a line of dialogue and no real action other than we're on her and she is desperately trying not to think about what has just happened, what she's brought about, like what she's in the middle of. And it's just so powerful.
And she's still wrestling it with the consequences because in the third arc, she brings him up again. Clearly, it has been on her mind.
It's like, this is the guy that, like, at least how I read it, like that in a different world, she could have wound up with. She could have been with. And, then Luthen Rail walks into the room. Who, by the way, is just a great character.
So I want to ask Isaac, what... how do you see that as sort of Deep Space Nine to Battlestar Galactica to Andor and kind of, obviously Star Trek is a different show and Star Trek is about family and it's about hopefulness. Andor is not a particularly hopeful show. It does show one person with a vision can make a difference, right? So that's at the heart of Star Trek. But Star Trek, the great thing I think that we all love is it is about a found family. It is about sort of the struggle to get to utopia. It is something that is inspirational to a lot of us. It's inherently optimistic. So when we, is this a fallacy when we say, oh, where's Star Trek Andor? Are they mutually incompatible? Or is a version of Star Trek that can be Andor? When we say that, we don't mean literally, we mean smart, I think is what we mean.
I wouldn't classify Andor as a cynical show or like, I do think it is optimistic and it is hopeful that despite how horrible that world is at the time, despite everything that's happening on planets such as Gorman, there is hope. And, the series finale shows that. I know you haven't seen it, Ashley and Caden, so I won't say any more on that. But it does, it shows there's hope. It shows that, like Star Trek, there can be a better future. And eventually, by the end of Return of the Jedi, you get there. If we stop thinking about what happens after Return of the Jedi. But there is a key difference between Andor and DS9. And I think that's that, like, Star Trek, let's think about it. When Star Trek was coming out, or when DS9 was coming out, TNG was on its 6th season. And I wouldn't say it had jumped the shark. The 2 episodes we get before DS9's first episode is the 2-part chain of command, which, is a lot of people's favorite Star Trek episodes of all time. Later that year, as DS9 is going, we get Tapestry. So Star Trek wasn't suffering. DS9 continued and allowed it to not die off with the end of All Good Things, and DS9 kept it Star Trek going through, and allowed it to endure, eventually, creating Star Trek shows such as Voyager, for better or for worse. But Star Wars, it needed Andor, because at the time, the sequels had ended and people, let's just say, weren't too happy with them. The spin-off series, Rogue One, Solo, not happening anymore because Solo bombed. And we had gotten a few shows, but the most recent one was Obi-Wan Kenobi. And from what I can recall, it wasn't received too well. I'm not done. So Andor really allowed for that rejuvenation. It allowed people to feel like Star Wars was back. And it allowed people who hadn't felt like Star Wars was back since either the prequels or the original Thrawn trilogy or the original trilogy. They didn't believe Star Wars would ever come back. But Andor gave people that hope that, hey, we can still make good stories. We can still tell original stories that aren't just fan service, that aren't just pandering to their audience.
Caden, I want to ask you, prequels are precarious, and yet these franchises seem to go back in time for a franchise that's forward-thinking a lot. I mean, Andor takes us back before the original Star Wars, and I won't deign to call it A New Hope, the original Star Wars. And then, of course, even with Star Trek, you see for a long time now, Enterprise was a prequel, Strange New Worlds is a prequel, Discovery was a prequel for a while, and then it wasn't. Star Wars is the whole prequel trilogy. What are the dangers of going back, and how did Andor avoid that?
See, I think with stuff where you're jumping through different parts of the timeline, I don't think the time that something takes place in a series is not a concept for a film. It's a setting. It's not a story. And I think there are too many films that treat going back in time for like a prequel as their whole story. That's the whole concept. Rather than something that is set like a while back within the story, but that's not like the main concept. That's not what's important. And well, it is important, but it's not like the main focus of what that series is about. And I think Andor does a good job of avoiding those problems.
Rob, we're ready for a Luthen rant. We're prepared. We're gonna unleash the beast. We've set the table. We know, I think we have all very nuanced views of Star Trek. You, on the other hand,
get your Skarsgård on, baby.
No, okay. It is no secret to anybody who watches my YouTube channel or anything to know that I have not been content with the state of Star Trek since 2009. And I think one of the problems that Star Trek has as a franchise that other people don't have is that the people that have been given the stewardship of Star Trek, I don't think really respect it or what it can do. And I think that they are here. The real problem is, I'll give you an example. We've all seen Galaxy Quest, right? I love Galaxy Quest, but one of the big problems with Galaxy Quest is when you actually see the Galaxy Quest TV show that everybody's a fan of, it basically is as sophisticated as a Saturday morning cartoon show. It's not a sophisticated show. And most of Hollywood believes that Star Trek is the show in Galaxy Quest that the people are fans of. They haven't watched Star Trek. And if they try and watch it, they have this weird, they can't get past the production design, it's all campy and wacky to them. But if you think about a classic Star Trek episode like The Doomsday Machine, 1 second season episode, everyone likes it. This is a very somber, very serious, very science fiction episode of a show where you have an ancient race somehow made some machine to fight a war and it escaped from them, presumably destroying them, which refers back to nuclear power, whatever. And this machine is now rampaging through the universe and destroying, star systems. That could have been enough for any show. But they turn it into a human story where we meet another captain, Captain Decker, who has lost his whole crew. He tried to do the right thing and everything he did was correct, but he lost everybody he was under his command. Hundreds of people died. And he is a shattered human being, and he's turned into Ahab, and he wants to do anything to restore his dignity or get his revenge or make some sense to this horrible tragedy. And at the same time, Captain Kirk not only has to manage Decker, but also has to figure out a way to stop this rampaging machine from destroying the rest of the galaxy. And he doesn't have necessarily the power or the tools to do it. So here's a show that's working on many different levels. It's an hour-long episode of Star Trek. It's a classic episode, but it was a standard episode of Star Trek. And there is so much going on. Cut to the second episode of Strange New Worlds that we just saw last week. It's a wacky story about Christine Chapel and Spock and their relationship, and Christine's fiance is coming on, and oh wait, let's bring Trelane into it too. The episode really isn't about anything. It's just about all this wacky stuff. There's no higher-minded story being told. And if you go back to a classic Star Trek episode like This Side of Paradise, which is another first season episode where you find out that Spock, he meets a girl in his past, Leela Kalomi. Leela Kalomi was in love with him. He could not feel the same way about her as she felt about him. But because of the situation that they set up, he does, because he's affected by these spores, and he can frolic in the fields with her. And she thinks that he has fallen in love with her and that they can live a life together, which obviously they don't. And at the end of that episode, Spock goes through all this stuff, and what does he say at the end? I know for a moment I was happy. Now, we're all watching this, and you can see it on many levels, but it's dealing with human truths that all of us have had at some point in our lives. We've had unrequited love. We've been in positions where we wish things were different, but we know they're not going to be. And we have to deal with those things. And Star Trek at its greatness was full of truth that we all had in ourselves that we could see reflected back at us in the context of a science fiction show. Since Star Trek of the modern age, what we've been getting is not that. What we're getting is shows that no longer know how to tell the science fiction part of the story. All they can tell is regurgitate the human interactions, the emotions. Star Trek is not a show about the interpersonal relationships of the crew. They have episodes that deal with the interpersonal relationships of human beings, but there's no ongoing romance in classic Star Trek. They incorporated it into the shows as they went along, but they did so in such a way that the relationships of the two people, Jadzia Dax and Worf, for instance, people of two worlds, how do they maintain their relationships when they're very different? Rather than will they or won't they, it becomes something about, again, how do different people come together to create something larger than the sum of their parts? Star Trek is no longer about that. And that's the problem, because the writers who have been given the stewardship of this franchise don't know how to write those higher-minded ideas because they've never experienced them. They're only writing stories about the interpersonal relationships of people and will sprinkle it with Star Trek. When we need the opposite. We need people that know how to write science fiction that can then incorporate, whether it's interpersonal relationships or even the comedy of classic Star Trek was situational. The Trouble with Tribbles still was a story about ecological espionage. It was still a story about a conflict between two great powers. A piece of the action. Hey, it's a Chicago mobs of the 20s story, but really it was about the dangers of what happens when one society contaminates another. And the crew of the Enterprise is having to deal with the fallout.
Well, Rob, I think we're at a crossroads because it's the 59th anniversary. Next year, it will be 60 years of Star Trek. So the question we all have is, what is the future? Obviously, that works on many levels because Skydance is taking over Paramount. They may have very different view of what Star Trek is than the current owners. That could be great or not, we'll see. So my question to you, and we only have a few minutes if you want to line up at the mic, is what do you want to see from Star Trek at 60? And or are you seeing it now? Are you really happy with the state of Star Trek right now? Or what are your hopes going forward as we reach this really critical birthday? Because there's no question. We talk about Star Wars. Everyone knows what you're talking about. You mentioned Star Trek. It's much more niche. It's not a universal franchise anymore the way that Star Wars is.
Before we go on, I just want to say two very quick things.
Let me say this.
Let me say something. Number one, I mean, I do want to
Number
say
one?
something in the defense of the writers on those shows, because I know a few of them. And I don't want to speak for any of them. I will simply say that someday, and it will not be today or tomorrow, there's going to be a great book, or maybe
There shall be an awakening.
great documentary about how things happen in Star Trek as we know it. Because if we would only judge Terry Metalis on Picard Season 2, we would never know that he was capable of Picard Season 3. So, but that's
Well,
one. The
actually, you would, because you would have seen the 12 Monkeys TV series, and in the 4 seasons, they did
So
a great
they're
job
not
with
just-
time travel and science fiction.
My point being that there are forces that are beyond their control, which brings me to the second thing, which is I would now also never presume to speak for David Ellison, but I can tell you that David legitimately does love Star Trek.
The head of Skydance.
Head of Skydance.
Who will soon be the owner of Paramount.
And I suspect that his instinct will. If I were a betting man, I would say that whatever comes out of it will like more. Can I guarantee that we'll love it? I don't know, but I think that a lot of things that bother us will stop bothering us.
There will be changes.
There will be changes.
And
Let's
it
say
will.
that
It
way.
is on their radar. It is an important franchise for the studio, so it will not be forgotten about. That is for sure. Go ahead.
I just want, me personally, I'm not as sophisticated as you guys are, but
Well, that's true, Corey. You're not.
We're not even that sophisticated.
The problem started with the movies, the Abrams movies, and when I looked at Into Darkness and that scene where Chris Pine is flying his ship and Zoe Saldana and Zachary Quinto in the background arguing, and it really hit me like, this isn't Spock, Kirk, and Uhura, this is Han, Luke, and Leia, and to me, that's where we're at.
But are you talking about in where?
In Star Trek.
Star Trek Into Darkness.
Oh, yeah. I mean, well,
The worst big budget science fiction
But
film ever
JJ
made.
said he was never
Ever.
a Star Trek fan. He was a Star Wars fan.
Goonies is better.
And
Finally.
Go ahead.
Thank you for this panel. I would love to see the aftermath of the Dominion War. It's like the Dominion War happened and then it stopped, but how did they put things back together again? And I think that would be very allegorical for right now, what we're going through. So, see some of the world's Cardassia, Bajor, did they come into the Federation and things like that?
No, that's a really good point because, if you look at the period after the Civil War in America, what a fertile ground that would be for allegory and metaphor. And the Dominion War was so important, and so many people died in that. And the Federation was, largely crippled. So, to just say next week, we move on, the consequences of that would be interesting to explore.
One of the things about that, if you read Star Trek novels, they had 20 years of continuity post-Dominion War, and for the most part, there's some amazing writing that went on in that. And then, of course, the new series killed that continuity. They had to reconcile it with the shows, which is another reason to dislike.
And if you want to hear Rob talk more about the Star Trek novels, you can. Rob's like, you've read every Star Trek novel ever published, haven't you?
I stopped at Coda when the Star Trek continuity was ended. Okay. Because then all they're going to do is write new books.
It's still an incredible achievement. Well, I don't know if that's the word for it. It's still an achievement.
For me, one of the things about Star Trek that's interesting is its struggle with there's conflict, but there's not conflict. It seems like over the course of its history, it really was trying to figure out how much conflict am I allowed to have and not allowed to have. And it seems like with a series like Andor, it's the exact antithesis, which is like, I really want conflict.
That's a much...
I can't have it. And so I'm just wondering how much of that in your minds is the inner dynamic of why something like Andor struggles to come up.
That's a much longer panel because what you're alluding to, it's a great question, is Roddenberry's box, which plagued the writers of Next Generation in particular. Because if you notice the whole idea that Roddenberry had with Next Generation is that the world is perfect, there is no conflict between our characters only from the outside, really only happens with Next Gen when he started believing his own press releases. And that's not what happens on the original. It's like everyone has the same goal, but there's an immense amount of conflict between characters. Obviously, look at McCoy and Spock, right? But Rick Berman enforced this idea, which was kind of a misnomer, that there is no conflict. No, that's Star Wars. There is no conflict. But there was a feeling that there was no conflict. And of course, that's something that's kind of gone away.
It's destructive conflict.
But it was a destructive to misunderstand the idea of what conflict is in Star Trek.
Yeah.
Would you say, Ashley?
No, absolutely. I think like that whole thing from Roddenberry, like you said, he was just smelling his own farts at that point. And there was a thing that he had to sell, and it was all bullshit. And it's the reason why the first few seasons of The Next Generation, with a lot of, with definite exceptions, were so effing boring compared to the original series. And when it came back in Deep Space Nine, that's why it got great.
But then you still get great stuff like Measure of Man whenever they kind of escape from Roddenberry's box.
Exactly.
Suddenly
Philip Lavoie is like really interesting, and like there's real honest conflict in that episode.
It was very limiting for the writers, and they found some great ways to get around it. But Roddenberry's box was not a real thing. It was not a real thing. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you. So Andor and Star Trek at its best are subversive shows, and we talked about the studios a little bit, but when I think about Andor being hosted by Disney, to make it explicitly political, they have been more willing to go to toe with governments in charge, people in charge, and we've seen Paramount very much do something very different very recently. And I'm wondering how much you think that outlook on the political landscape has affected Paramount's treatment of Star Trek.
Well, you're alluding to obviously Paramount's abhorrent behavior lately to get the merger approved by basically kowtowing to the administration and how absolutely repugnant that is. But I think with Disney, it wasn't really. I don't think Andor was even though it's an immensely political show, it was not considered a show because it's dealing with. The French, it's dealing with the French during World War II, and it wasn't even clear how much it was reflective of today until much later.
No, and it's like, look, we tend to take things that are happening around us and we project them onto what we see, right? Like, I could do a counter argument all day long that Star Trek and Star Wars aren't inherently subversive, that they're the exact opposite. But we live our lives and we take like what we're watching on television as part of the context of how we interpret things, right? Which is why like we look at Andor and we go, oh, Rorschach test. I see a blah, blah, blah. Well, you know what? I guarantee you if it had come out 2 years ago, you still would have had the same Rorschach test result. The context would have been different. And that, I think, is why Star Trek and Star Wars and Andor, like at its best, are so great. Because it does not require a specific context to work. If they did, they would be shit. And they're not. They don't require that.
It's worth noting that whereas Andor is much more subtle in its politics, and the fact that Tony Gilroy even said, this is not based on anything specific. You look at the pilot for Strange New Worlds, and it's very in your face, but it's not saying anything about that horrible day in Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
But it's using it as the fodder to try and pretend it's a political show when it's not, but it's not saying anything complex or deep. But that's an interesting question, and again, that's a whole nother panel probably, but something we should look at.
Also, I just want to say that, great storytellers, especially when you're dealing with allegory, they don't point to something necessarily and go, look, this is supposed to be this. It's allegorical, so it really is supposed to be in general. You suddenly become didactic and boring if you're trying to be like, oh, I'm going to draw a line from here to here. What you want to do is great storytelling it doesn't tell you what to think. Great storytelling gives you things to think about.
Yes, very much true. And Captain Kirk, you're going to be the last question. We only have time for one more question, but thank you for all these really smart questions.
I'm looking at the hair.
Vegas is going to have its work cut out for them because you guys asked such good questions. I hope that Vegas can ask the same good questions.
Yeah, me too.
Go ahead.
Sober.
So what was disappointing is that we were so close to having a Star Trek Andor series, and that could have been Section 31. And we had a template for how to do stories that have moral complexity and conflicted characters in the pale moonlight. And we could have had a Section 31 series or movie that had a conflicted protagonist who had...
I had nearly forgotten that Section 31 happened.
But you're
and
not
now you're
talking
throwing
about-
it in my...
You're not talking about that Abomination, the TV movie. You're talking
About the
about
idea.
Section 31 as the template for a TV series that could be released.
It could have been, but
And now I need a drink.
it'll never happen now because of the Abomination.
Right,
God.
exactly.
But I mean, if they had used the existing template from In the Pale Moonlight, where we have a hero who's conflicted, who has to make difficult moral choices and make decisions for the greater good, very much like Luthen in Andor, we could have had a series that was beat Andor by 2 years and would have been terrific and told great stories about political intrigue.
As we say on Earth, c'est la vie.
Yeah.
I want to say to everybody, thank you. You can listen to Inglorious Treksperts every Thursday, wherever you listen to podcasts. We're now finally on YouTube. We finally got our act together. Thank you to our great panel.